Let's roll. This is Countercharge, your podcast for ranks, flanks, and kings of war. Join your hosts as they delve into the world of Panithor and bring you worldwide coverage of all things Kings of War.
Welcome to Countercharge. I'm Ray Shields.
And I'm Rough Enough, and we're really glad to have Ray on. It's been a long time coming. Ray, you've been on many times before, but it's been a long time. So let's remind the American listeners in particular, who is Ray Shields?
I'm Ray Shields. I got into the hobby in 2016, Kings of War in 2016, when Jake Hutton, Jake Karapika now, held a one-day speed tournament for Kings of War. It was 1,200 points, and I figured I'd show up with my old Ogre army. And it was a blast, and I kept playing since then. I traditionally played in the Mid-Atlantic up until 2020 when I moved back to Canada. COVID hit, so travel south of the border was a bit difficult for 2 years. And I'm getting back into Kings of War now that I've moved south and I'm closer to the Canadian scene, largely based out of Hamilton, Ontario.
And you've got a podcast. Tell us about Nerve Check. Where did that come from, and where can we get it?
Decided to create a podcast focused on the Northeast and Canadian scene. So it's localized. Ben was the one who brought up the idea with John. And it was just to be like, highlight what we're doing up here in this scene. Our tagline is that we're the best podcast for Kings of War listened to by tens of people. Sometimes we break into 100. We're on YouTube and we're on Podbean, but mostly we're in the tens. We talk about the Canadian and Northeast tournament scene. We talk about the events we've gone to. Sometimes we do army reviews if we have a couple players up here who play that army. For example, both Ben and I played Trident Realm, so we did a Trident Realm review. We're probably going to do a pretty in-depth Trident Realm review for the 2025 Clash of Kings because we both play it and we both have thoughts. We did Forces of Abyss because we have a couple people who played that. And we did Riftforge Orcs, which is one of the ones that doesn't normally get talked about by the wider community, but we had 3 players who played Riftforge Orcs and who could talk about it with some depth. So most of the time we try to get out and have a conversation about once a week. It is absolutely not edited. So you get what you get. Opinions are unfiltered. We don't quite have the production value that's here on Countercharge.
I'm really excited. Are you ready to get into List Builder Studio?
Absolutely.
The List Builder Studio.
All right. Well, let's kick it off with, what draws you to an army? Is it like, how the army plays, or is it like a perceived weakness or the rarity, or is it the models? Just give me a sense of, generally speaking, what draws you to a new army project?
For the last couple of years, I've been kind of out of the community. Both COVID's a good excuse. The other excuse is having 3 children. So I have a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. So that put a bit of a damper as to how much time I had for modeling, which affected my choices going into the 2024 Masters this past year. Because going into a list, going into an army, I'm always about what does the army do? How does it play? And then once you figure out how the army plays, then you can go, does it suit my style? Does it suit what I want to do with the army? If it does, great. If it doesn't, I need to find a different army. After I figure out what army I want to do, the next thing is coming up with how to make it look cool. There are a lot of better painters than I am, but one of the things I love about Kings of War is actually the multi-basing. I love being able to create dioramas, being able to test my skills and to try something new each and every time. So my hobby journey was first I tried ogres. I tried ogres for about 2 years. I wasn't able to get them to go. They've been regulated to the dustbins of the closet of shame. And after the ogres came about 2017, the Rat King came out. I played them for about 3 years. I had a lot of fun with them. They were big stompy blocks of nerve and combat ability that did great. And then after that, I wanted to try something nimble. So I went to Trident Realm because it was a different play style. Lots of multiple small units, lots of fast, lots of nimble, lots of Pathfinder. A very different style from what I did with the Ratkin. And I tried that for a year or two. And then moving up into Canada, wanting to show up to Canadian events, try something fun, I did orcs. Because no one can ever get upset with a player who's playing orcs. It's just one of those things that you can't do. Like they're taking orcs to the tournament. They're taking a giant. If the giant rolls a 6, well, it's life. It's the giant. So orcs are my fun army. I use my Lord of the Ring models, and I custom based everything into holes to fit them all in. Each time I'm doing a project, I'm trying to figure out something to make the project a bit cooler. For Trident Realm, it was the first time I used a resin pour to have the aquatic theme. Ratkin was the first time I did multi-basing. And right now with the Forces of Abyss, the latest project, I'm doing a whole diorama such that every unit has a spot, and combined, kind of like Voltron or one of the Transformers, you get the custom display board. So if I put all my units down on the board, they form the display board and everything fits in the theme, but then you can pull them out and play with all the pieces. So each time I've done the project, I've tried to one-up myself as to what I've been able to do, both from a painting perspective, from a modeling perspective, and try to make it a bit better. I switched to Forces of Abyss because they were coming out this year. I got to play test with them. I thought the Abyssal Berserkers would be too good. They're very good. I don't think they're broken. And I've given myself the challenge to play Forces of Abyss for the entire year, which is something I haven't done before in my Kings of War journey, is play an army continuously throughout the year, because I think everything in the Forces of Abyss list is pretty good and playable, with the exception of Succubi Larva, so they're not going to see the field. But I'm going to try everything else over the course of the year, try all different combinations, and just really have fun with a list, which is something I've never done. I think it's going to be a challenge to like play shooting Forces of Abyss using the Flame Bearers, to play speed, to do an infantry line, to do a trash list with lower abyssals. So I think it's going to be fun. It's going to be a painting challenge, and I'll see how it works at Masters in 2025 in Reno.
I'm excited, though, in this episode to explore with you. You just mentioned how, play style and the modeling opportunities pulls you to an army. But I'm also going to be interested to see how those are affecting your list building.
Coming up with this latest tournament, Nerdhammer, that I attended, there are two things a list has to do in my mind. You either have to shoot well enough to draw your opponent into you, or you have to have enough speed such that you can dictate the charges. And what I found is that if you have a list that does neither of those things, and I've tried an orc list that was all speed 5, it didn't work. It was a horrible experience. The list got trounced. I made an entire episode bad-mouthing that list that I came up with, because I didn't have the shooting ability to bring an opponent into me. I didn't have the speed to get to them. And I didn't have the speed to dictate the charges, because speed could be king. With the Ratkin, I tried something where I had Phalanx and Ensnare, and I had the ability to absorb the first charge. And that was a unique play style. It was the ability to say, hey, look, I'm going to rope-a-dope you by taking the hit and then counterattacking to knock you out. Forces of Abyss, with the way I came up with them, they didn't have that ability to take the hit. 16-18 nerve on the Berserker Hordes wasn't enough in my mind, but they're speed 9, so they gave me a lot of choice with the ability to pick my charges. So going into a list building situation, off the bat, I look at the book and I think, what is my list going to do? Am I going to take a hit? Am I going to give a hit? Or am I going to shoot to dictate the action? Because there's really, 3 phases of the game. You have the movement phase, you have the combat shooting phase, and you have the combat phase. And you have to be able to perform in each of the phases. It's the golden triangle of being able to act in each of the 3. And you can sacrifice one to perform better in the other 2. But you need to be able to influence the game in the various aspects of it.
When you look at the way you play the game, are you typically looking to answer questions from your opponent, or are you looking to ask your opponent's question? Like, are you proactive or are you reactive?
I think that you have to be able to design your list such that you can handle the various list archetypes. And what I mean by that is you need to be able to answer, how do I deal with flyers that are speed 10? So if you hit the Green Lady, if you hit Aloha, if you hit, now Kingdoms of Men seem to be increasing in popularity. If you hit a speed 10 army, how do you deal with it? if you're going up against a defense 6 wall, if you don't have an answer to the defense 6 wall, I think there are over 5 dwarf players at Nerdhammer, then you're going to lose that game. So you need to have an answer to it. And you need to have an answer to the shooting. I think when I build a list, what I'm thinking about is, can my list answer each of those 3 or have a response to each of those 3 challenges? And I look at them more as challenges than hard counters. But when I'm going in to play the game, one of the things that Erica Trowbridge told me at the U.S. Masters that took place in New York was that you don't have to win the game by a lot. You just have to win it by 1 point. So when I'm setting up to play the game, play the scenarios, I'm going in with a viewpoint that I want to win the scenario by 1 point, because a win's a win and 1 point's enough. And that's the way I approach the actual play of the game. So I trust that when in the list building portion, I've designed my army such that I can answer those 3 questions. Can I deal with speed? Can I deal with defense 6? And can I deal with shooting? Once I have my list designed such that I have counters to each of those 3 things, I can go in and then play the game such that I'm playing it for scenario with the answers to those 3 questions. So right off the bat, when I'm setting up the table, I try to take a couple minutes to just think about how I want the game to go and how I want it to look at the end for a scenario perspective. That being said, control is one of those scenarios that's really hard for me. I've listened to your podcast where you focus in on the various scenarios and what you do. Seeing how control works, especially against something like ogres or an army that has lots of unit strength 1, special characters that can move about, that's a really hard game to visualize because at the end of the board, they can scatter every which way.
How do you incorporate flexibility into your list building?
So to some extent, when I played my Ratkin, I think I played about 3 games without Scud. So Scud is my universal toolkit such that he can answer the speed 10, he poses a threat, he can do just about everything, but you pay the points for him. And for me, he is my flexible piece when I'm playing Ratkin. And I cannot play a Ratkin army without Scud. I just can't get it to work. I tried a couple times and it just doesn't work for me because I need that piece that has the answer to everything. When I'm playing Order of the Green Lady, the piece that I enjoyed playing with was actually the Naiad Heart Piercers because they provided the shooting and the unicorns to disrupt. So having a speed 10 piece that can do everything and answer any issues you have for 1 turn is traditionally my go-to flexibility piece. In Forces of Abyss, it's turning out to be a seductress. Again, a speed 10 flyer, 5 attacks, can hit, can buy me 1 turn. And it's buying me 1 turn to correct an issue, an oversight, or to give an answer to something which I otherwise don't have. Ratkin at Scud, speed 10, and the Unicorn in Green Lady, speed 10, same idea. Speed 10, 360 arc, able to provide a solution for 1 turn. No guarantees that will survive that 1 turn, because once you put it into combat to block a charge, to slow down a horde, to do something, probably dying the next turn. But it has bought you the time, given you the flexibility to say, I can anticipate that. That was a bad dice roll. Something went my opponent's way that I wasn't foreseeing. And I'm going to use this piece to buy me that moment in time so that I can adjust my battle plans on the go. With the orcs, it would be a Morax Mansplitter with Wings of the Honey Maze. Again, speed 10 individual. There are a lot of points. They don't provide unit strength. A lot of people don't like playing with that kind of item because they see it as a waste of points from a game perspective, which is largely gone towards unit strength. But for me, it's the insurance. I'm paying 150-ish points for an insurance piece at the end of the day.
Do you use Universal Battle for either playing or for testing out lists?
I do. I use Universal Battle for play test. I do both play by email and live play test on Universal Battle. I will traditionally try to get 1 game on there every month or so. Sometimes a game a week and a build up towards Masters or something like that. I've found it's good for play testing, but it doesn't give me the same the same feeling as being in person. It's kind of fun to being in person, to talk about the list, because that's the fun part is just having those friendly discussions to talk about what went right, what went wrong. When everyone's posted and seeing those really bad dice rolls on Universal Battle, but if you do those in person, when you fail a 5 dice Bane chant and you're just scratching your head going, how did I do that? Like, what are the odds that I'd fail 5 dice? Those are the fun moments that I like to have. That being said, if it's gearing up towards Masters, I'll get on Universal Battle a bit more. I try to do some of the Universal Battle tournaments and just play it from time to time.
When you're building a list or as you're playing the game, do you organize units into smaller combat groups or battle groups? Is that a concept that you think about, and does it resonate with you?
It does. The idea of battle grouping and saying that these 3 units work together or those units work together, it's a great idea. It means that you know your army, you know how the army works. A prime example would be is if I'm taking 3 heart piercers or 3 flame bearers, I'll put the 3 of them together because you need that level of shooting, probably, in an area to have an effect. With my most recent list with the Forces of Abyss, I hadn't played it enough to have any battle groups, so I was just trying everything. I was trying to see, like, how does the army perform if I put each of the units in different spots? And I had no set battle groups. So I think to some extent the shooting is an easy one where you put it together. Your nimble pieces, it depends upon the opponent. Do you want to break through? So you mass a flank. I like doing that traditionally, but I also like the idea that I can just spread out my pieces. And on first turn, if I don't like the way it works, I just turn 90 degrees and run my full speed at the march, at the double, to reposition. Trusting my ability to reposition quicker than the opponents. But that being said, there is a lot of value to knowing what does your army do. And I had this discussion with Keith where I said, you can have your battle groups and you can have what you want to do, but you have to set it towards the terrain. So when I'm coming up to the table, you'd like to have how you would set up your army in an open field. And if there's no terrain on the table, that'd make for a very boring game. So with the terrain on the table, you look at the table and you see, what can I do to force the engagements I want? How can I set up? And then let the terrain dictate your battle groups. Let the terrain dictate where you place your units at the end of the day. You want to have your Pathfinder units, obviously, either going through terrain or charging into terrain. You want to use the hills to mitigate the opponent's shooting. You have to play based upon the scenario, whether or not you're going to push a flank, both flanks, or go towards the center. Can you use a hill to get the additional Thunderous 1? What's your height differential between you and the opponent? So the terrain is really the third person in the game, because you have the opponent, and then you have the terrain, which makes up the third person. It never moves, so it's a very compliant third person, but it's the third person on the table. And you have to use what you can to adjust your plans for whether or not there's a blocking piece right in the center. If it is, then how do you get around it? Do you only operate on half the board? Do you try to split your forces? I traditionally don't like that. But if I look across the board and there's a blocking terrain outside of your deployment zone, about a third of the way in from either side, I know that's going to cause an immediate break in your lines, which means that that's an opening for flanks. And I can position myself such that I know that either you're going to have to operate on only 2/3 of the table, split your forces, and how you're going to deal with that potential break in your lines. So that's a prime example of where blocking terrain creates those opportunities, both to anchor a flank. So if I was playing Ratkin with plague plots and phalanx, you put your flank against the blocking terrain and you say, here I am. I'm defended on one side and I trust whatever's going on the other. But if you have to push beyond it, it creates the openings that the opponent can use to hammer you and to cause issues. That's what I think of when I'm looking at the terrain on the board is how can I use those differences, the speed differences moving through difficult terrain versus the open to get the advantage.
When you're thinking about terrain, are you looking to have Pathfinder, or are you taking magical artifacts to give you, Strider boots? What you just talked about was a lot about the deployment and how your army is going to lay on the table. But when you're building a list, you don't know what table you're going to play on. What type of things are you considering when you're building the list about terrain?
So whenever I'm building a list, I always want to have the Boots of Striding, so Jesse's boots, unless my army has Pathfinder built in, like the Trident Realm with the frogs and Ocean Worm Riders, etc. But if your army doesn't have a significant amount of Pathfinder, I think the boots are almost an auto include at this point in time, because you need to have an answer to the terrain. And if you don't have that answer to the terrain, then you're at an immediate -1 to hit. If somebody has ensnare in the woods, you're -2 to hit, which means you're not going to break it. So from my perspective, that has always been an auto include. It's one of the reasons why when I play the Order of the Green Lady, I like to take one of the regular units of knights, just because they have the banner that gives Pathfinder. So then I'd have 2 units with Pathfinder in a Green Lady list. And I think with regards to the orcs, them having the ability to do the 3-point command to gain Pathfinder for the units that charge is one of the ones where I might not take the Boots of Striding if I was playing orcs now, but just if they were playing with command dice, because I trust that ability to give me that option to get through it, get around it. I don't think there's a good answer to somebody to not take a Pathfinder item or a Pathfinder unit. I think it's one of those things that you need. Looking back at my Forces of Abyss list, I only had 1 unit with Pathfinder, which was the Jesse's Boots. And I think it was one of the weaknesses of the latest list that I built. And it's something I want to address going ahead by including other units with both either Striding or Pathfinder, such that I have about 2 or 3. And I think once you get to 2 or 3 units with Pathfinder or Striding, you can adjust your battle line on your deployment for whatever terrain's on the board. It also depends upon which meta you're going into, because the various areas, regions have different amounts of terrain. Obviously, if I was going to Blue City Brawl, I'd probably expect the entire table to be covered in terrain, so Pathfinder would be more desired. Northeast is typically terrain heavy. Mid-Atlantic, Southeast is largely less terrain heavy. So it comes down to where you're playing, what are you expecting to see. So you can tailor your army as well for the meta that you're anticipating.
What consideration do you give to the number of drops in your army when you're list building?
So at 2,300 points, if you're coming in with 11 drops, I don't think you have enough. I think you're hyper elite. You're spending over 200 points a unit. And I haven't seen it used well because all your units cost a lot and you're deploying them before you see where the opponent is. And you need those opponents' units to do work. You need them to buy back their points. So I think 11 units is not enough. I think, on the other hand, once you get to about 13, 14 seems to be the sweet spot right now at 2,300 points. But that's just my experience in this meta. There is a lot of advantage to having more drops. There's a lot of advantage to having more drops and more unit strength. Good measure for unit strength is you want to have at least 1 point of unit strength per 100 points in the game. So if you're playing a 2,300 point list, you probably want to have at least 12 drops. So divide the number of points by 200 and round up. So I give you 11.5 rounds up to 12. So you want a minimum of 12 drops, 23 unit strength. Obviously, if you can do more units, that's better. If you can do more unit strength, that helps to the point where you can get goblin armies, orcs, ogre armies that are into the 30 unit strength plus. If you're playing a game and you have that advantage in unit strength, for scenarios such as Invade, I played in Invade, looked at my opponent's list and went, I have a 5-point unit strength advantage on you. All I have to do is set up on this side. I'm going to walk across the board and I'm going to win by 5 points. I don't even have to fight you. Like, you have to fight me, not me fight you. So there is great options to having that. Likewise, if you have the last drop and you have that dragon character, if you have Scud, if you have something like that, and you're able to, or an Order Forsaken Horde, and you drop the opponent, being able to say, I can keep this very powerful piece to the end, put it where I want, and you're not going to see it. There's a lot of advantage to both of those things. So I think having the unit strength advantage, having the drop advantage definitely helps. It gives you a bit more flexibility in deployment. It gives you more flexibility in playing the scenario, especially unit strength, because you can just say, I'm going to play the scenario. I'm going to play it to win, but then I have all these extra points that I can lose or use to like slow you down. And it doesn't matter if you kill them because I still have bonuses on top of that. But that's where I see it right now. My current list I'm running is 13 drops, 25 unit strength. So I'm slightly above that. With my rats, I was about 14, 15 drops with about 30 unit strength. Playing with 30 unit strength was a lot of fun, more so than the 25. I played 2 games against people with 25 unit strength where it was like, okay, I can't just march across the table. Like I have to fight you because I have to kill some of your unit strength. Otherwise, I won't win the game. Whereas with 30 unit strength, you're like, okay, I can just do what I want to do. And you have to come up with an answer to me. So I guess in summary, having extra unit strength and extra drops provides you flexibility. So that's one of the ways of gaining flexibility is to have that advantage in numbers and drops and unit strength.
And when you're thinking about those drops, how does whether something's an individual or a scoring unit come into play?
I think for the most part, the game has moved away from individual. Well, I used to say that. I don't know how that's going to be impacted by Command Dice, if I'm being honest. I would say that it was moving away from individuals, but then Command Dice would increase that requirement. One of the things I'm looking at now is how do I include Duelist into my list? So if I don't want to put money into Command Dice, if I have Duelist, I have the ability to hunt your heroes with triple attacks being a real thing now. Hunt them down, kill them to take away the Command Dice, to take away the Inspiring, to take away the Auras. So I think that's become something to consider as you're building your list is what do I need to do to use my individuals to kill your individuals? What do I want my individuals to do? I think with the flags being very inspiring, flag bearers being very inspiring, providing auras, there's definitely an advantage to having some individuals, but I'm always cautious because each one takes away points that you could spend on unit strength. And at the end of the day, it's unit strength that wins you the game. So when you're taking an individual, think about what do I want this individual to do? And is it worth the points? Sometimes it could be a flagger with Bane Chant, thinking orcs, that unicorn with Host Shadow Beast, the druids to provide you Surge. Like, individuals are still very useful in this game, but you have to remember that that's not how you win the game.
And when you're building armies and when you're list building and we're talking about unit strength, what are your thoughts on, regiments versus hordes?
I think that regiments provide you a lot more mobility, a lot of speed advantages in terms of being able to travel between the terrain and not be blocked due to large size. So I like them. But the issue right now I'm finding is that they don't have the nerve and staying power to take a hit. So you can have your cheap regiments, which are designed to be speed bumps, be chaff, be unit strength filler. One of the things that I was very grateful for with my Ratkin list was I had 2 regiments of spearmen. And they were 95 points apiece. I didn't give them plague pots. I might have given 1. But at Masters, they performed really well for me because they provided me 6 unit strength and 2 drops in every game. And everyone ignored them. So when I was creating my Forces of Abyss list, I included 2 regiments of lower abyssals, 95 points apiece, 3 unit strength. And those units at 3 unit strength, 95 points, just provided so much value as a regiment, not for its combat ability, not for its ability to take wounds, but just for its ability to provide unit strength and cheap drops that I was happy to have them on. I don't think the Horde would have done me the same advantage. I think the Horde makes it a larger target that the opponent has to provide an answer to. Whereas right now, they're 2 units that the opponent can largely ignore. And if it's a close game, that lets me often eke out the edge in scenario. I think regiments are probably, specifically regiments of infantry, are probably 1 to 2 points of nerve lower than where they would need to be to take solid hits in the game. It's one of the things that has me excited about Forces of Abyss is where the Abyssal Guard provides Rally 1 to the other lower Abyssal Infantry. It increases the nerve from like 13-15 to 15-17, which all of a sudden means that you can't just put a couple lightning bolts in and kill them. You can't charge a single monster in and wipe them out in one turn guaranteed, or highly likely. It just gives them that little bit of extra staying power. And for the Abyssal Guard going up to dash 18, it just makes them... Dash 18 is the real nerve to push through, whereas dash 16 is what everyone is gearing up to fight. Dash 15, 17 ogres, 15, 17 siege breakers, or 14, 16 regiments are currently what everyone's geared to fight. And once you can get above that level of nerve, like mummies being the classic example at dash 18, are a unit that is super tough, hard to get through, takes a bit more than whatever you think you need to do to deal with that mummy regiment. And if you don't deal with the mummy regiment, they will come back, hit you, and make you pay for it. I think regiments have a place. I think cheap regiments are really good. I think expensive regiments are really good. I think the ones that are currently suffering are the middle point costed regiments, in between about 140 and 180, because either they have to really be good at what they do. The Thule regiments at 160 were a classic example, especially in the formation. They were good at what they did, but largely you don't see them.
When you're thinking about unit strength, how does the durability of that unit strength come into play? You hit on a little bit, if you have a horde, it's going to have a much bigger nerve and it'll probably survive a turn. But, there's other things that obviously a Ratkin player, rally, will also affect the durability or the defense. When you're thinking about how much unit strength you want on the table, how does durability play into that?
Well, I think it comes into play from two sides. When you're playing an ogre list or playing against an ogre list, they have a lot of units. So then the quantity has a quality all unto itself, because you're talking every single ogre individual is a unit, every single unit's a unit. And even though their nerve is not particularly high, it's 15, 17, individuals are 12, 14, 11, 13. So they're not super high, but just the sheer quantity of every single individual, every single unit being scoring means that it's still a lot. When I'm coming up with my list, I don't actually think about that. I don't think about how much unit strength needs to be alive in terms of the durability of the individual pieces. I'm more concerned with trying to maximize the number of pieces I have, and maximize the amount of unit strength I have. So I'm thinking more along the lines of the ogre player, saying that if I have enough pieces and if everything can score, or as many pieces as possible can score, then I'll sort through the durability of everything at the end. One of the issues coming up with the Forces of Abyss list was, do I take out one of my scoring units on a Berserker Apostate for this Seductress? So it was I'm going to lose one unit strength to gain an individual. And that was the trade-off. But I wasn't thinking about how durable the individual hordes were in terms of taking a hit cleanly, because I'm trusting that when I'm playing the game, I can use the terrain to hinder the charges, to do the piece trading such that if I'm losing unit strength, I'm going to cause my opponent to lose unit strength as well. And I think that's one of the things that, if you look at this as a piece trading game, you're less concerned with how durable your individual units are with what you can do to take out your opponent's units. One of the things I have seen increasingly is the Celestial Restoration, used by dwarf players to heal their units, their defense 6 units with D3 per success. And seeing that, you can understand where it's a dwarf mentality to say, I'm going to survive the hit, I'm going to heal, I'm going to use Radiance of Life, Celestial Restoration, any heal I have, and get my unit back up to full strength because you can't break me. And what that does is it creates kind of the arms race, such that if you're playing against them, you need to know, when I charge in, I have to kill the unit, because if I don't kill the unit cleanly, you're going to be able to heal it. So it's just a difference in terms of play style, in terms of what you're looking for. How do you do it? But the individual durability of the unit, if you're able to answer defense 6, you can answer anything less than defense 6. That becomes less of an issue, and it becomes more a question as to how many units are on the board where they're located, what their speed is, and how they can work towards winning the objective. Key speeds being speed 6. I find that speed 6 is significant advantage over speed 5 because it lets you get to the center line of the board for any of the token scenarios. So I actually think more about the speed of the individual units than I do their durability. Because if I can get to the center line of the board for loot, plunder, push, and being able to force the first turn where I can be on the tokens against my opponent, it at least gives me the opportunity to push my opponent to think about that, to think about how do they want to respond to me, and cause them to have some questions right off the bat. I found that speed 5, speed 4, nothing's worse than being a dwarf player playing loot against an opponent who's faster than you, who can grab the tokens first turn and punish you for it. I think more about the speed. I think more about the requirement to play the scenario that way than what I do about the durability of my units.
What about height? Does that play into list building at all?
I've heard a lot of people talk about the joy of different heights and being able to stack and form your units. I like being height 2, ideally, or certainly height 3 and nothing more than height 3, because I don't want to be seen. I want to be able to use those hills to hide from the shooting in the meta and not have my head poking out above the hill and getting it shot off. So the advantage with height 2 is it makes it harder for goblin wizards, for the various war machines to be able to see your troops. So I really enjoyed playing a height 2 army where everything was the same and you couldn't shoot at me. That being said, I've played height 3 as well with Order of the Green Lady, and that's fine because you're still hidden by the hills. There is advantage to having a couple height 4 units. Height 4 for chaff with the Pegasus are amazing. I think Kingdoms of Men are using them exceptionally well with their wizards. So I think there's a lot of advantage to height 4. I haven't used height 5 to any great extent. So height 4 for chaff is wonderful. Height 3 and height 2 to hide behind hills. Height 1 for screening forces if you want them. And then if you want the odd height 6 just to dictate in the back or dictate your lines or see over the opponent, it makes sense. But it comes down to the play style of the army. One of the things I found was that Manifestation of Baal was height 4, which means he was able to be blocked by lowly wizards and Pegasus in a Kingdoms of Men army, which was less fun. But the Phoenixes are a great example of a height 6 unit that's just a pain to deal with. So I do think about the heights, both of my army and the opponent's army, but my significant thought going in is I want height 3 or lower to be hidden by the hills so that I can have more options for terrain and cover when I'm setting up so I don't get shot off on the first turn. One of the most annoying things is if you get shot off first turn or a key unit shot off before you have any chance to do anything. You're like, okay, well, that's 250 points off the table. I guess I'm playing the game down a bit. So it's one of the things I try to do is to avoid that, whether it's only setting up 6 inches or 5 inches up the board instead of the full 12 inches. But it varies by opponent and varies by the table.
How does Ray deal with chaff?
There's 2 ways of dealing with chaff. Either you have it or you have a way to deal with it. And in most cases, I like to have an ability to deal with chaff. The easiest ability to deal with chaff is through shooting. As I said, Ben likes to play Trident Realm. Trident Realm have probably one of the most effective chaff pieces in the game with Tidal Swarms, especially if they're covered with Barkskin as well, because they have Ensnare. Dash 12 and Barkskin up to 4 or 5 makes them exceptionally difficult to deal with. But if you can shoot them, either Fireball, Lightning Bolt, etc., then you can take away their nerve, kill them, and that frees up the opportunities for you to do the charges that you want to do. So that's my preferred method, because if you have shooting and the opponent doesn't have chaff, then you can shoot their main line. And that's bonus points. Like you get wounds on their lines. If they heal them, well, you haven't lost anything. If they don't heal them, then they're weaker for when you charge in. That being said, with the Ratkin, they clearly have their Vermintide, which is a chaff piece, which I used, but I began using the claw shots as my chaff to go in front of my units. Because I was like, okay, I just want these people to go forward, set up the charges, get in the way, cause issues for my opponents, and let me win. So it really comes down to the the old saying that every single piece can be a chaff piece if required. Clearly, you don't want to begin with your most expensive pieces being chaff, but if they have to be, they are. When I'm designing a list, I do like to include a couple chaff pieces. Currently, in Forces of Abyss, I'm looking at more Abyssal Guard troops being chaff because they're dash, because they can hit. But I don't really want to use chaff if I can help it and I can avoid it with shooting. So I've used it. It's good. It lets you set up the charges. I've avoided it through shooting, but you have to have one of those two options. Just going around with no chaff, with no shooting to deal with the opponent's chaff, it's just a recipe for failure because the opponent can set up every charge on you, line them up clear, and deliver them on the turn that they want to. It will not make for a fun game on your half.
Let's talk inspiring.
When I'm looking at my list, I want to have 3 sources of inspiring at 2,300. Less than 2,000, probably 2. Models that go away and work on the flanks by themselves don't really count towards that number. So I can go with 2 at 2,300. I don't want to go less than 2. And I can go with 1 at 1,995. But ideally, I want 2 pieces. Oftentimes, you'll find a special character who's a wizard who lets you gain the inspiring while having the benefits of the spells or something like that. That's a bonus. If I'm looking at a list that doesn't have inspiring, unless it's like Night Stalkers, the question is why? And given the advantage of the standard bearers with their auras, with very inspiring, I think the time where we didn't see inspiring on the table has passed. I'm going through all my recent games in my head, and I can't think of a game where my opponent didn't have at least 2 pieces of inspiring on the table. So I know that was a thing in 2nd edition to go with 1 or no pieces of inspiring and just trust the dice gods, but I think the game has evolved. Almost everyone is taking 1 to 2 pieces, if not more. I think 3 is a sweet spot, left, center, right. I wouldn't even say it's army dependent. I think most armies actually have it at this point in time. It's just what pieces do you want to provide that inspiring? And that becomes the key question. Do you want it to be a fighting character? Do you want it to be a wizard? Do you want it to be a monster of some form? What's going to provide the inspiring? And what else do you want those inspiring pieces to do? I think the Rules Committee has done an excellent job making the standard bearers give you the options. I think the war chiefs are good. I think it's gotten to the point now where I want to include a duelist just to go hunt those individuals down. So I've gone past do I want to have inspiring my list? Do I think it's required? Because I've seen it in all the lists. I want to begin to hunt the opponent's inspiring pieces and take them off the board. Because it is such an advantage to having the option to roll for double ones. I think it's a 5% chance of rolling double ones. You never think of it being that high, but it's almost 1 in 20. And when it happens, it is often game changing to have those moments of double ones, or it can be. Being able to take away that 1 in 20 chance, reduce it down to 1 in 36, just makes the game better for you and lets you help control an aspect of the game that is otherwise just a random fate of the dice.
What about magical artifacts?
I am a horrible person for magical artifacts. A lot of people say, what would be the expression, boys before toys, because they want more units than they have magical artifacts. And I am the one who's like, no, let's kit out everything, boys. We're going to war. We're going to empty out the artifacts, empty out Dad's closet, pull out the Brew of Strength, pull out the Boots of Striding, pull out the Drunken Ram. Reflecting upon it, you want your hammers to hit hard. So, especially with an army that hits and on 4s, you need some measure to kind of average out the curve. Jeremy talks a lot about dice variance. I don't fully understand what dice variance is. It's the unpredictability of rolling 4s on 30 dice. Beyond that, I haven't actually measured it. But I do know that if I can give my people who hit on 4s, be it Ratkin, Abyss, etc., then it lets me even out the curve, because anything that hits is more likely to convert. That's one of the things I do. It's not just the items, it's the auras provided by the leaders. But with regards to the items, I think the overall required one right now is for probably 20 of the 26 list, Boots of Striding. Depending upon the meta, you want to be able to have an answer to Defense 6. And very few people are higher than Crushing 2 base. So that means that you need to either be considering Bane Chant, a reliable Bane Chant, or you need to be considering Brew of Strength, something else to get you to Crushing 2, Crushing 3. Because if you're not at Crushing 2, then you don't really have an answer for how you're going to deal with Defense 6. So that's the next thing. And once I have those two items sorted out, and items for my hammers, and I'm prepared to spend 100 points on items for my hammers, three hammers, etc. After that, chaff do not get items. Characters, wizards, you're looking at, you want one offensive spell for before your lines hit, and you want one spell once your lines hit. And what I mean by that is, classic example, Lightning Bolt coupled with Bane Chant. Lightning Bolt, Drain Life for ogres, but you don't want more than 2 spells. Like, you can have more than 2 spells, maybe Host, Scorched Earth, and something else. Scorched Earth, Heal, and Bane Chant maybe might be a combination of 3, but even then, I don't see it as focused as, this is what I want my wizard to do. And you probably want the 2 spells because you have 2 different occasions in the game, turn 1, 2 versus turn 3 onward. But that's also a waste of points, which I think of as artifact points. So I think of the spells as artifact points. I think any aura I have to pay for is artifact points. And I think of artifact points on the units. I haven't fully worked out in my mind the impact of command dice on artifact points. And what I mean by that is the 1 command point for accuracy to reroll a spell is kind of like having Conjurer's Staff on any of your Bane Chants. So before with Bane Chant 2 and another spell, I'd want to put Conjurer's Staff to increase my odds of success to 87.5 from 75%. But I can get the same impact through 1 command point. So I haven't fully figured out how command points will filter into my list building at this point in time, but it's something I'm considering. And that being said, not all tournaments are using command dice, so I think there's a bit of tailoring your list to whether or not the tournament is using command dice or not. If the tournament is using command dice, I'm probably going to be more willing to accept a 2-dice spell with no mitigation, because I can use the command die to give me, in essence, a 3rd die or a reroll. There's no command dice, then I'm probably more likely to spend the 10 points for Conjurer's Staff. If I'm going into the Mid-Atlantic, high likelihood of dwarfs, I'm going to grab a Brew of Strength, whether I'm playing, and it doesn't matter if I'm playing Trident Realm, Green Lady, or Forces of Abyss, possibly not Orcs. I think Orcs are probably the only one where I don't use Brew of Strength, just because everything hits. But I want to have that item such that I can burn through the Defense 6 with some assurance of success. So I do tailor my list to the meta, to what I can anticipate playing, and I'm not always right. I thought I was going to see a lot of cavalry flying armies at the US Masters. I took phalanx on my entire army. I think I only played 1 game against Jeremy where his list had flying. And other than that, I didn't play my other 5 games, the opponent didn't have flyers, didn't have calves. So I wasted the points and I misjudged the meta. But that's life. Like, if you're playing that style where you're building a list to be counter meta and using the points that way, it can work out well or it can work out really poorly.
Going back to spells, talk to you though, what's the balance between offensive spells or defensive spells like wound mitigation?
I don't think I really use wound mitigation in my spells. So my spells are all about offensive. I haven't ever actually played a Defense 6 base army, which is where wound mitigation would make the most sense. So my spells are all focused on either clearing the chaff through Fireball, Lightning Bolt, being the 2 primary examples, and then ensuring that my units hit. whether it's Bane Chant. But one of the spells I do like is I like Scorched Earth. I've seen it used against me. It was painful when it was used against me, but it's not one of those spells that I've seen often. It's not taken very often. Most people avoid it. It's a lot of points, but it is one of those spells that causes a complete change in the calculus as to what you were planning. So if you're planning on hitting on threes, 18 dice, wounding on threes, you're looking at 8 wounds. But all of a sudden, if it's fours and fours, you're down to about 4 wounds, 5 wounds, and less assurance. So it is one of those spells that disrupts the opponent's battle plan. It's horrible, and it's very good. We don't see it a lot. I've grown an appreciation for Wind Blast, such that you can, especially if you can move your opponent off of the tokens, off of the objective counters at the end of the game. I like it. I think it has a real good place in the game. It helps a lot with shooting armies as well, or Alpha Strike armies where you're trying to push a unit to be outside of the charge distance after you've shot them. So I like Wind Blast. I like Enthrall. Mind Fog took me a while to really see the advantage of. And one of the units that I think the RC has done a really good job with was the Siren, being able to cast the 4 spells. At first, I wasn't keen on what the Siren did, but seeing her in action, seeing her be able to Wind Blast, Enthrall, Mind Fog, and I forget what her 4th spell is, but cast all 4 spells, none of which are the traditional I'm going to hurt you or I'm going to buff my units to hurt you spells that I would normally use, was insightful. And I remember in one game, they tried to Wind Blast me off of an objective and then Mind Fog my Pegasus. And if they had rolled 11, they were going to win the game. So it was a last ditch effort by the opponent. Mind Fog 11, they win the game. If they don't, they don't. The Pegasus wasn't inspired because he was 30 inches away on an objective. But it was a really neat use of the Mind Fog, neat use of the Siren to try to change the game in turn 6. And I can appreciate what was being done. So I like a lot of this. Wither and Perish is one of the spells I haven't seen used well in the one game it was. So there are some spells which I don't necessarily know what they add to the game at this point in time and are of questionable validity, but everyone seems to come up with the list that makes use of those spells in that one occasion or 2 occasions. We saw what Weakness did for the Twilight Kin. I think you augment your list with the spells to enhance your strengths or cover up your weaknesses. And in my case, my thinking on the spell use hasn't evolved to those complex movement-focused spells other than in a shooting build with Wind Blast and Enthrall. But it's probably something to look forward for me to do in an army post Forces of Abyss. Try something with that.
Let's talk flyers. You mentioned Scud earlier. Just how do you account for speed and flyers in what you're building within your list, but also the opponent, what you're expecting to see?
Well, one of the nice things was changing. They got rid of Boots of the Caterpillar, which meant they went from 2 items that could cause terrain mitigation down to 1 with just Sir Jesse's Boots, which means that when you're coming up with a list and you're worried about flyers, you have your 3 options to deal with them. You can shoot them, because oftentimes flyers are high and able to be seen, able to be shot. You can have a flyer of your own to play chicken between the 2 flyers as to who's going to make the first move. You can use Phalanx. And the 4th item is you can use the terrain. Or multiple lines, actually, has been the other way I've dealt with flyers. So in each of my armies, when I was playing with the Forces of Abyss Speed 9 Max, I would use the Abyssal Berserker Regiments as my chaff to go ahead to force the engagement with the flyers, to say, I know I'm going to have to sacrifice this piece, but I want to take out one of your flying pieces as a result. It's going to cost me, but I want in the counterattack for it to cost you even more. With Forces of Abyss, I did peace trading. When I was playing Trident Realm, I did a layered approach. So I threw a unit of Thule, let's say 6 inches in front of the other unit. The Thule have a charge range of 13 to 15 inches, meaning that even if the flyers back up, they can't get out of range and they can't charge the second line Thule. So the flyer is then forced with the choice of, do I charge the unit in front of me, or do I move out of the way, turn around, back up, etc., and run? Because if you're running two lines, you can force the charge such that they either hit the front unit, they land in between, but then they haven't hit your back unit, which gets to kill them, or hit them, lock them in place, and then hit them. With Order of the Green Lady, I got to use the flyers, which is part of the reason why I enjoyed playing Order of the Green Lady. It was nice to give everyone fits as you run 5 flyers on the table and make people think about what they're doing. And part of the reason why I ran the rats after Order of the Green Lady was I'm going to take phalanx, because phalanx and ensnare means I don't care about flyers as long as they're hitting me to the front. So the whole goal is to keep them in the front and stop the opponent from being able to get any flanks or rears on me. So I think each army has an answer to flyers. Even if the only answer is I'm going to have to offer them a charge, you can offer them a charge with something that has less points, which if they don't take, you can hopefully get into them, ground them, and then win the combats. No army doesn't have an answer to flyers. That being said, not a lot of people are building phalanx heavy list, and I think that was the case when ogres were higher in the meta. I think we're seeing a meta shift right now. I think if the meta shift continues towards more flyers and more cav, there might be an increase where more lists have 1 to 2 units of phalanx, but I'm not sure we're there yet.
Let's circle back to deployment. When you're thinking about your army during list building, are you thinking about how the army is going to be deployed? Are you coming up with in your mind how, in an ideal situation, this is how the army would deployed? This is where, I'm just saying ogres, but the warlock's going to go here and here and here. And are you thinking about that?
I am absolutely thinking about that. So when I'm playing Order of the Green Lady, I knew that I needed 3 units of heart piercers to have enough shots, 15 hits, 7.5 wounds, with some lightning bolts to challenge a defense 5 unit. And again, as I talked about earlier, 15, 17 nerve was what I'm thinking about. So if I can do 7.5, 8 wounds, 9 wounds, I'm up to a 6 to waver, 8 to kill. So I know immediately I have my block of 3 heart piercers, which I want to go into the open. I have my knights in Forsaken, and that's where the thought process then begins to break down, because my shooting is pretty clear. It's the open lane, it's what I want to do. But the knights, oftentimes I thought through, do I want to try to get both flanks, or do I want to try to get one flank? Because you don't want to get no flanks, because then what are you doing in the game? So you want to win on one side at least. And the question comes down to, well, the opponent knows that I want to win on one side. So as you do in the deployment, you have that, how much strength and effort am I putting on each side to cause my opponent to counter it? And am I going to try to win on both sides? It doesn't always work. And I've lost more than my fair share of games of doing that. But when I'm coming up with my list, if I'm saying, here, look, I have 3 hammers, then, simple math, do I go 2 one side, 1 the other? Do I go 1 in the center, 1 left, 1 right? Or do I go all 3 on one side? And I've played games where it's been each of those, but each time it's been different and dependent upon the scenario and the opponent. And it comes down to, do I have a speed advantage? Do I have a shooting advantage? Those are the first 2 factors I'm looking at in the game. From a list building perspective, the question is, how many hammers do you need? And hammers are units that can, in my mind, take out a 15, 17 nerve defense 5 unit, in excess of 11 wounds on it, 12 wounds. Because at that point in time, you have them down to 5s, you should be able to kill them. You need to have at least 3 hammers, 2 to 3 hammers in a list, preferably 3, because most opponents can deal with 1 hammer, and then you're down to 2. They have their hammer, it doesn't really work. But if you can add a 3rd hammer into your list, then you can cause issues for how your opponent has to respond to that. And then the question comes down to, which way do you deploy your units? And my favorite method is to go 2 on one side, 1 on the other, because I found that I wanted to have a counter to their strong wing. When I'm playing Ratkin, my shock troop hordes are my strength. I try to anchor them on a piece of impassable terrain, let them push through the enemy, and I would use Scud actually as my weak anchor. So Scud would be the one covering my other flank, trying to buy me time as my shock troop hordes push through. Didn't always work. Sometimes doesn't. But that's where he would be because I found he was strong enough by himself or with limited support to be able to hold off the enemy units, buy time for my main force to push through. With Order of the Green Lady, Horde of Forsaken is a great anchor because they hit hard enough with 18 attacks, Crush 1, Thunderous 1, and Speed 10 being the key that the opponent has to treat them with respect and can't just ignore them. So that was an awesome anchor unit, and then push on the other side. When I'm playing Orcs and Goblins, Giants are wonderful anchors because they're huge blocks of nerve. You can put them in terrain because they have Strider. They can also attack, and you can use a Horde of Long Axe to be the anchor, or regiments if you really just want to dump a couple of regiments of Young Axe at the end of the day. So I like doing the one flank strong, one flank weak, and something in the center. That's my preferred setup. But that being said, I'll adjust the setup to the terrain and to the opponent.
Let's talk scenarios, because obviously when you're playing a game, you mentioned control is a difficult one, right? If you're playing against armies that like ogres that have a lot of nimble unit strength units, how are you considering how your army is going to play the scenarios while you're list building?
When I was building a slow army, and I call Ratkin slow because my Ratkin were speed 6. With the exception of Scud, everything's speed 6 or less. So in my mind, that's a slow list. What I do is I try to hug the board, try to hug the impassable terrain, do the push through the center, play one flank. So I'm going to load the one flank that I'm pushing on with the objective tokens, ignore the one on the other side. So if I'm playing loot, classic example, 3 objective tokens, 3 loot tokens in the middle, I concentrate on the 2 together, ignore the third one. If I can get the third one at the end of the day, great. If I can't, I can't. I listened to the Countercharge podcast where they talk through the scenarios, and you had an excellent series with all the US Masters on that gave great advice as to how to play the scenarios. And I listened to those episodes, and I really learned a lot listening to them as to how to play the various scenarios and how to think that everything at the end of the day is going to come into the center. It doesn't always work when I'm playing a slower army, speed 6, speed 5, as to getting my stuff into the center, but at least I'm thinking about it. It also taught me to think about the 2/3 rule for flyers. If you can put your own flyers on the 2/3 mark and 1/3 mark of the table, like a foot or 2 in, instead of being right on the edge, then you have a much larger threat window left and right. So if you put your flyer 24 inches from your table board edge and they have a 20-inch move, they can already get to the edge of the table if they need to, or they can get all the way to the center. So that was some great advice that was on that episode as well. I've thought through the scenarios really as being 3 different types. There's the area control, not just control, but dominate, control. What's the new one? Hold the line, where it's the 3 across the center. Those are enjoyable scenarios, but ultimately it's coming down to being in the middle. There's the token scenarios, and the classic being push. So when I'm doing list building, I need to have something that can carry a token. Not such a big deal for a Ratkin list, but for something like a Green Lady list, it's important because what's going to carry your tokens across the board? What's going to go down to speed 5, lose fly, lose nimble, and just walk across? In my list building, I try to include some infantry regiments for exactly that purpose, to carry those items. And then you have the unit strength scenarios, invade, dominate, etc. So those are the 3 classic archetypes of scenarios, and being able to understand what your list needs to do in each of those 3 episodes. How do you plan on winning? Changes with the speed, with the power of your list, whether your list is shooting. You just need to win by 1. And if that means that you got your 3 pathetic infantry regiments across the board and lost the other 2,000 points of your army, stopping the opponent, you still won 6-3 and push. Have a game plan for those 3 types of scenarios. The one that causes a lot of confusion, which I've begun enjoying, is the bluff token counters. I know they're not used a lot. They really support the player who is able to think through the end of the game as to how they want to use the tokens and where they want them to be at the end of the game. And then next, they support the faster army, which is able to adjust their game plan to the tokens as they're revealed. I found that I've enjoyed playing those scenarios recently. And when I was at Crossroads, I would choose those scenarios if I was given a chance, just because it would throw my opponent off, because it's not a scenario commonly played. And I'd be like, here, we're going to play Fool's Gold or whichever other one, just to be that guy, because we don't get to play it a lot. It's not chosen frequently. And it's one of the ones where you can have a bit of agency as to how you want it set up. A bit of poker, which I'm horrible at, see how you can win those scenarios. But in essence, 3 different types of scenarios. Token scenarios, where you have to have something that can carry it. And you list building, you better be thinking as to how am I going to carry the tokens. Second is unit strength, which when you're building your list, if you don't have one unit strength per 100 points on in the game, you should be saying, should be a good reason as to why you don't. And the third is area control.
How about progressive scenarios? How is that going to affect your list building?
Changes your style of play more than it changes what your list is. At the end of the day, come up with a list that you want to play. Because if you want to play it and you enjoy playing it, then even if you lose, like, it's still fun. Like, I could say, hey, look, I'm going to take my orcs and they're going to be great. But I'll be lying. Like, my orcs are not a tournament winning list. So if I'm taking orcs out, it'd be great if I can go 4-1. 4-1 is an amazing day for the orcs. 3-2 is a good day. 2-3 is still fun. Like, so first thing, take a list that you have fun at. Take a list that has an answer to the 3 army, like defense 6, movement, or shooting. And as long as you can answer that, then you can force your opponent to have to deal with the fact that you can deal with the threats. So it's a double play. If I can deal with your defense 6 and we're playing the double dominate, then I can move in, and if you're dwarfs and you move in, I can still threaten you, cause you pain, hit your units, etc. I think there's issues that need to be worked out with the scenarios, progressive scenarios, in terms of not allowing one side or the other to win at the end of turn 4. But I think those are some of the scenarios that still need to be worked on and developed. But it comes down to knowing the scenario, knowing that it can be won as early as the end of turn 4, that going second is the massive advantage it is right now, and how you're going to deal with that, more so than any list building thoughts at this point in time.
You play in a lot of tournaments. You've played in the Masters. How does the scoring system of the event affect how you build your list?
So if you're playing a straight 15, 10, 5 with attrition adjustment and no scenario adjustment, then you build your list to have more grind, less loss. It encourages more of a shooting build, because one of the ways you can play the game is if you're building it with shooting, you're not into the piece trading to the same extent. So if it's a straight, you win 15 points and you're plus 500 in attrition, that's a bigger win and more important win than if you won by 15 unit strength on invade, because the extra 15 unit strength don't matter. So Orktown's a prime example. It's a tournament, wonderful tournament, but doesn't use blackjack, doesn't use Bart Shroud or anything like that. So it is a win-loss-draw tournament with attrition. That being said, it has enough terrain that shooting armies aren't super prevalent, but you build more of a grindy list for Orktown. If you're going and playing something like blackjack, then I want to build a list that has more of a higher level of unit strength. If I can fit an extra 5 unit strength into that army list going into blackjack, I am better off, because I have the extra unit strength for that system of scoring that rewards winning scenarios more than it rewards attrition. And finally, if you're playing in Bart Shroud, I just take whichever list I want at that point in time, because I haven't fully figured out the optimum strategy for that. So win, loss, draw, you want to be grindy. You don't want to die, whether it's grindy or shooty, but you want to take that flavor of list. For blackjack, you want to take high unit strength, high number of drops, because it favors winning scenario by a lot more than it encourages winning by attrition. So I guess a quick summary, you win by 10 unit strength and invade, you might get and 0-0 for attrition difference. You would get 18-3 in blackjack. In win-loss draw, you would be 15-5. So it's just a difference as to which one encourages scenario play and which one encourages attritional play.
Does playing on a clock affect your list construction?
Playing on clock, you need to be very aware as to the elite and vicious rolls. I know that sounds really silly, but I saw a lot of people having issues with Twilight Kin and with the elite and vicious and rerolls. It's something that eats up more time than what you think about when you're looking for all the ones and rerolling all the ones and then rolling again and rerolling all the ones. I find that those are a bit of a time sink. I would advise people that having a set amount of dice, knowing how many dice you need to roll, having them all laid out. It's one of my OCD activities where I lay out my 30 dice, playing Ratkin, playing Forces of Bish, 20 dice if I'm playing Order of the Green Lady, and I have that as my 20 dice, and I know exactly where they are, and on my opponent's turn, I lay them all out in groups of 5, because come my turn, I don't want to be searching for dice, I don't want to be counting dice, I don't want to be thinking about it. There's my dice, that's what I have to roll. I find that's the biggest advantage in terms of dice on a clock, more so than list construction. I think the other issue, so it's more of a play style when you're playing on a clock. And the other thing is knowing when do I not want to take this charge, because I don't want to have to roll 90 dice to kill a catapult, and it's going to take me too long. Thinking through those issues are more important than the list building. But being aware if you're bringing a list that has multiple rerolls, multiple options, different ways of playing it, it is something to be aware of because it all adds time, and complexity to an army.
When you're building your list, are you thinking about, I want this army to go first, go second? Are you thinking about that? Is that a conscious thing when you're building your list?
No, I don't think about that at all because it's not something I can control. So that isn't one of those things that enter my head.
And I assume it's the same with the turn 7 roll.
Right. Because you also have no idea what you're going to have left on the table at the end of turn 6. So turn 7 is one of the ones that's really hard to account for. That being said, like some of my favorite games are games that have turned with turn 7 that I've lost, that I've tied, that I've won. Like I had a great game against Ed where I was winning on turn 6 and he got to turn 7 and he took my win down to a draw and he had a chance to win. And it was an absolute blast. So I love the turn 7 mechanic. I absolutely do not plan for it in list building because I have no idea what I'm going to have left. But it's one of those mechanics that is enjoyable that I don't know how you would get rid of or change because it forces you to play turn 6 honestly, I guess is my way of putting it. Like if you knew that turn 6 was the end of the game and you could just turn your units and flee them or do whatever, then with no turn 7, the opponent doesn't have the chance. But with the possibility of a turn 7, it means you play 6 turns honestly, not knowing if there's going to be that turn 7. So I love that mechanic. I don't plan on it. I don't plan on going first or second. That being said, when I had the 18-inch shooting with my Trident Realm, I would prefer to go second because I wanted to get my shots in. So I do think about whether or not I want to go second yes, I do think about if I want to go second or first, but I don't plan on going first or second.
How does the annual Clash of Kings update affect your list building?
Well, I think I'm rather fortunate right now, both Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, because we have the Masters in the summer and a fair number of events in the summer. And then it's coupled by Crossroads at the end of September, which is an absolutely huge event that Corey puts on. I think we had 88 players last Crossroads or something like that. A massive number. And it's a team tournament, so everyone wants to do well in the team tournament or wants to play at a reasonably high standard. So you're still working through your list. You're still planning it right up until the end of September. And then being honest, the leaks coming out in October or the book's already out in September or leaks are coming out and you can begin figuring out how is the new Clash of Kings going to come out. Previously, when the Clash of King book came out in December, you would have that bit of a lull between the end of September and December where you're kind of in limbo waiting for the book to come out. But right now there's enough tournaments and they're running with enough frequency, almost more than one a month, building a list, playing with it right up until the new Clash of Kings come out. That being said, I wouldn't start a new list. I wouldn't start a new army anytime post summertime, unless it's I want to build this army because I want to build it. Because I don't know how Clash of Kings will change it, how it's going to change the points, what it's going to do to it. A prime example is Empire of Dust. I've been wanting to build an Empire of Dust for a long time. I keep wanting to build that army. And the latest changes where they allowed them to have scouting with the infantry changes how that army plays. I still want to play it, still want to build it. Just if I had built it before, then I'd have units and I wouldn't necessarily have the builds. So Clash of Kings is important. It probably does slow down the desire to build a new army before it comes out. But that being said, that's only by a couple of months.
Does your hobby ever trump everything else? You don't care. I'm building this cool unit, regardless of the implications of changes in Clash of Kings or whether or not they're effective on the table. I mean, you ever had a situation where your hobby trumps the game?
So I've had the opposite. I've had the game absolutely say that I will not build that unit. And the succubi larvae will never be built in my army because I would never use them on the board. But if I'll use a unit on the board, then I will build it and I'll paint it. So right now I have like the lower abyssals, the gargoyles, and I'm working on all that. I think there's enough flexibility in this game that if you want to do something and you can do it cool, everyone's accepting of that. People want to see cool armies. People want to see well-painted armies. Actually, correction. I just want to see a painted army across from me. It doesn't even need to be well-painted. Like just let's have two painted armies on the table, play it out. And that's really where I'm at this point in time. I have an Archfiend of the Abyss. I'm not really using it. So I put him on my display board just as the overseer of the army because I wanted to paint one. I have one, which I guess is the answer to your question, but I'm probably not going to use it. And I have the Lord of Lies model because he looks cool, and I'll paint it, and it'll be on my army, and it'll be on the display board. I'll create a little space for him, but he's not going to be in my army. So yes, I do paint and have pieces just to have pieces, which I don't plan on using regularly, but I may use once or twice just to try them out and to justify my time and effort in painting them. That being said, I don't paint to the same standard that Jeremy does or the higher level painters. So it'll be painted as a display piece model more than a hardcore army unit.
How does your list building process change depending on the amount of points you're playing?
So when the list gets below 2,000, my list building thought process is I can go from 3 hammers down to 2. And so I can reduce the number of hammers by roughly 25%. I haven't really, when you're going down for speed tournaments, I don't take vicious, don't take elite, don't take anything else like that. I want to keep it as simple as possible because it's a speed tournament and you just want to run it through. And that's the way my head works for that, which is a bit different than the point tournament total. So the time on the clock matters to me, and the point total does matter a little bit. It's harder to use dragons in the lower point tournament games because they eat up so much of, and by lower point I mean less than 2,000. Less than 2,000, harder to bring dragons because you don't have the unit strength to spare. And once you get over 23, 20, when you're playing at 25, 2600, you don't have the board space for the dragons. So what I found is that there's actually a sweet spot, 2100, 2400, where you can get the big flyers and they can have an impact on the game because the board's not saturated with units. When you go to Orktown and you're playing 2665 and the board is covered from one end to the other, then there's no flanks. There's no a way to use a dragon effectively to find the angles. Or it's harder. It's not impossible, but it's just harder. So at the higher point totals, you have more hammers, you have more ability to crunch units, and you have to think that way. So having like the one Seductress is probably not enough. At 2665, I'm going to have 2 units to be my response action items. But under 1995, I'm probably going to drop the dragons. I'm going to drop my response units, and I'm going to focus even more on unit strength and drops.
Have you had any experience with ambush? And if so, how does that affect? I mean, now we're talking low points, like 750, 500, and how would that affect list building?
I haven't yet had experience with ambush, so that's probably something I'm going to look at for introductory games.
What is the most overlooked thing that impacts successful list building?
I don't have a good answer to that because I'm thinking through all the tournaments, and I would say it's probably focusing on something you want to do and doing it well. Chet at Nerdhammer brought an army that was super fast, super maneuverable. Almost everything was speed 10. So when you're bringing that level of speed, you've delved into it, you're guaranteeing it. Ed at Masters had a lot of D6 with the Siege Breakers, coupled with some shooting, and that's what his list did. So picking one of the themes, Alpha Strike, shooting, etc., knowing what your theme is, knowing what your army does, and doubling down on that actually tends to be the most successful trait. But that being said, to be successful, I heard from one former U.S. master, it's the right scenarios with the right opponents with no bad luck. So regardless of whatever you do, you need that combination of things to win the tournament. That being said, you can be successful to an extent by knowing your list, knowing what it does, and knowing how to use it against the opponents.
If you're giving advice to a new player that's getting into the game and wants to build a solid list, what's the most important question they should be asking themselves during list building?
What army are you excited to play? At the end of the day, removing little plastic men around a table, talking to the opponent for 2 hours, hanging out. What do you want to paint? Because whatever amount of time we spend playing the game, we spend far more than that painting, hobbying, etc. So if you're not excited to hobby it, if you're not excited to play that army, then you're not going to put the effort in to get the army done. You're not going to get the effort done to play that army. And when you lose with it, you're going to be really annoyed because you don't actually love the army. To anyone coming new, I would say try to avoid as many special rules as you can. Pick your army, pick whatever army you like. Try to avoid as many of the special funky rules as you can to begin with. To just learn the game. And that's probably where ambush is good. Learn the game, learn the basics, learn the movement, play the scenarios, and have fun with your army. And once you've played it a couple times, played through the basic scenario, basic army, then you can add some features to it. Then you can add the magic. Then you can add the items because you know what your army does. You're probably going to lose those first couple games, but you might not. But learn what your army does, have an idea as to how it's going to play, and after you've done that, then make the additions. So build the cake, then add the icing.
Looking back at your career in Kings of War, how has your list building process evolved over time? Are there any lessons you want to share?
I did not like playing ogres. I tried ogres for 2 years. I could not get them to work. It's clearly not an ogre army problem because they won US Masters and they win multiple tournaments. I just don't play ogres. So don't force yourself to play an army just because it's the new hotness, it's the new Mantic release, it's the new whatever. In my case, it's because I had the models and I had never used them before, but and so I was learning the game, but I should have dropped them earlier and begun painting the rats or a different army. Because if you're not happy with the army, if you're not happy with how it's working, don't be afraid to try something new. Do at least give them 10 games before you give up on them. We have a person here in Ontario who religiously goes to each tournament with a different army, and Lord knows how they actually manage to paint and prepare and have an army ready for every tournament, but they do. But it means that you don't get the practice in, you don't get the reps in. So to some extent, use an army that you're happy with, get some reps in. But if it's not you, if it's not how you want to play the game, then just find a different army. I'm glad I've gotten to that point where I'm just going to find the army that works for me rather than trying to force the army upon myself. Because at the end of the day, we're paying money to go have fun, to hang out with friends, and to push plastic soldiers. So just enjoy what you're doing. It's a hobby.
Next up, Ray, if you have a list that you want to share with us, maybe start with the background of the list, what drew you to the army specifically.
So I'll bring up the Forces of Abyss to begin with. And if we have time, I'll kind of show how it evolved out of the Ratkin list that I used for US Masters, because the Ratkin list is actually a bit more refined, played it more often, and I used it in more tournaments. Anyways, I guess we'll begin with that. Post-Crossroads Ratkin. And so this was the conclusion of the Ratkin after many years of experience. It was 2 spear regiments because I found them to be very useful. I found 3 hordes of shock troops to be the right number. I went to the Masters with 4. Brew of Strength, Sir Jesse's Boots being the 2 key items, and then a regiment of tunnel runners with Brew of Sharpness to give me 4 hammers, claw shots times 2, Vermintide to be the chaff. Claw shots were one of the things as to whether or not you wanted to go 3 or 2. At the end of the day, I found that there was enough Night Stalkers, enough stealthy, enough healing, that 2 gave me the punch to deal with chaff and to be an annoyance, but not too many points invested to be lost. Scud, Twitch. I love Twitch. I was a huge fan of Twitch because he let me reroll everything. And when you're hitting on 4s, being able to reroll everything was key. The War Chief with Loot and the Aura, because the War Chief is running around giving the Aura Vicious. So I had 2 sources of Banechant in the list, which coupled with the Shock Troops being CS1, I could go CS2, CS3 on the Crushing Strength Shock Troops, and Crushing 3 was enough to burn through Defense 6 and Scud. So what this list does is if I'm fighting shooting, then I put the Vermintide claw shots in the front, run forward 12 inches, let them die, pop the plots, and go in, fight. If I'm fighting Defense 6, I have enough Banechant with the 2 sources and the Brew of Strength and the Tunnel Runners that I can burn through Defense 6 with difficulty, but I can do it. Because almost everything that I want to be in combat has at least Crushing 1, if not Crush 1, Thunderous 1. And it gave me about 15 drops, 29 unit strength. So it was quite high. So I went from that to Forces of Abyss, where I swapped the spear regiments out for lower abyssals. I did 3 hordes of berserkers instead of 3 hordes of shock troops. Helm of the Drunken Ram, Jesse's Boots of Striding, and Strength. So very similar loadout to how I dealt with the shock troop hordes. I used Matsubisu as the special seductress. At the end of the day, she wasn't as optimal a build as a seductress with Gnome Glass Shield and Host Shadow Beast, but when you go to a tournament, you see the other people using armies, you take the notes from everyone else. I took the Berserker Apostate, similar to how I did with the War Chief, to give me the Vicious Aura. Speed 9, 8 attacks, though. He contributes a bit more to the combat. Abyssal Warlock with Banechant, Zuzuzu Betrayer with Banechant and Lightning. Again, I kept 2 sources of Banechant with a bit of shooting to deal with chaff. And then it was the Manifestation of Baal, who was my Scud replacement. He was a cheaper Scud replacement, and he's not as good as Scud, but I tried him out. And then I did the formation with the 2 regiments and the Nagari. So my thought process was I wanted to try out the Berserkers. I thought the Berserkers would substitute in for Shock Troop hordes, and I essentially ported my Ratkin army over to Forces of Abyss. But the army plays differently in terms of your speed 9, nimble, and you're the one doing the charges instead of absorbing charges. Bit of a difference in terms of the regeneration. It gives you some wound mitigation. One of the things I had issues with was the Abyssal Nagari, the Chariot Regiment. The models look really cool. They're big, they're beefy. You would think that they would hit hard, but they don't. 12 attacks at Crush 1 was not enough. So Army List challenge was against Speed 10 Flyers. I had two opponents whose armies were based on Speed 10 Flyers, and I drew both those games. But if I'm facing an army that was slow, infantry based, I was able to get the charges and options that I wanted. It was 13 drops, 25 unit strength. So in both cases, I'm above where I said the minimums were for units and unit strength, but this was probably the lower end of where I wanted to be.
I find it really interesting, though. You started with the, kind of the concept from the Ratkin list, and this is where you ended up, right? That's, I mean, I guess there's some overlap there, but
they play very different. But from a list design, like I have 30 attacks, Crush 1. If I add Bane Chant, will this let me get through Defense 6? And the answer was, I knew it would because it let me I went through Defense 6 with rats. So answer was done. Can I deal with shooting? Well, I have the Seductress, I have Bail, I can deal with shooting. Two sources of Bane Chant. So it was a very similar in terms of build, like two regiments to let me win scenario with the 6 unit strength in both army lists. So both army lists have some of the same. Can I play scenario? Yes. Can I deal with shooting? Yes. Can I deal with defense 6? And speed was the challenge for Forces of Abyss. For the rats, I just dealt with it by saying I'm going to have failings, and life is good.
What did the army do well against, and what did it struggle against?
So the Forces of Abyss list did well against anyone who was slower than, who did not have a large amount of speed 10. So I played Free Dwarfs, I played Green Lady, and I played a non-flyer Green Lady, I'll specify, Undead, and against those style of lists, I have the speed advantage. I can push the angles. Nimble is quite the challenge for opponents because it lets you have a lot of flexibility with your movement. But what I didn't do well against was the Alohi spam from a Basilia list, the Kingdoms of Men, Flying Circus, because they outranged me. And it was interesting because when I played the Alohi, Ryan's Alohi, he had 20 heal in his list. He had Iron Resolve, and he never used either of those things once the entire game. Because in the game, we were both at the point where when we engaged, we killed the opposing unit. So the heal, the regeneration, all of those points were just lost as units were just deleted from the game because it was two high speed Alpha Strike armies facing each other. Against Chet, it was a case in point where he outspeed me. So speed 10 is an issue for this list. I think actually Ensnare and Trident Realms will be an issue for this list, especially in cover, because they don't have an answer to it. And once you get melee 4 up to melee 6, does nothing. So I think this list has issues at this point in time, which I need to work through. I need to come up with a better answer to it. But that's one of the things that's always fun is you go through the list building process. You find what works, what doesn't work. I wasn't 100% happy with the formation. The Thunderous Charge on the regiments was great, but I wasn't able to use the Nagari for the aura for regeneration. I wasn't able to make it work the way I wanted to. So I don't think the list building is ever done. I don't think you ever have the perfect list. I went through how many years with my Ratkin, and my list evolved ever so slightly, but continue to evolve over the years, whether or not it was going to be 2 units of claw shots, 3 units, 4 units. Like the only constant throughout the 5 years I played Ratkin was Scud because I wanted Scud in my list. So I think that's part of the joy of the process is building your army, tweaking it, coming up with something new and seeing how it does.
What's the future for the list? I mean, obviously you've got some thoughts on changes. Is there anything imminent? Like I'm going to make this change tomorrow because I'm, going to go to a tournament.
I'm going to Dead of Winter. And for Dead of Winter, I'm going to drop the formation. It goes down to 2150. So I have to drop the formation. And I think I'm going to add 2 regiments of succubi and change the lower abyssals to abyssal guard. So the reason why I'm doing that is the succubi gives me Pathfinder, 2 additional sources of Pathfinder with the lurker upgrade. I'm dropping the formation, so that will work out. I'm changing the special character to the Seductress with Gnome Glass Shield and Host Shadow Beast, and I'm actually dropping Bael. I think Bael's great. I'm just dropping Bael for points. I think he's great, but I wasn't using him well in the tournament, and I need to get some more practice games with him at some point in time, which is not going to happen over the course of the Christmas holidays, to understand his From the Pit I Curse Thee special rule, which goes back to the advice where I'd give it to new players is like avoid the special rules. Because here I am, I took Bael into my first tournament with Forces of Abyss, and I forgot to use his special rule 4 of my 5 games. In the one game where I remembered it, it was important, but I still forgot it. And I'm not a new player, but I forgot the special rule. So if you're spending a lot of points on special rules and you're a new player, it's just one extra thing to think about. And even me, I had issues. So going to Dead of Winter, I'm dropping Bael, dropping the formation, adding the Succubi and Abyssal Guard to see how that works for terrain mitigation and whether or not that gives me what I need going ahead.
In terms of hobby for this army, anything special? I mean, what model range did you use? How'd you hobby the army up?
Well, this is my second fully Mantic army. The first one was Trident Realm. My Trident Realm army is 100% Mantic. My Forces of Abyss is 100% Mantic. And what I'm doing with them is doing the integrated full-on display board of a ruined cathedral with the pit causing the Forces of Abyss to come out. I'd love to create some element of water into it, just because I have the Trident Realm, because there's the fluff in the Clash of Kings 2025 book about the Trident Realm and the Forces of Abyss fighting. So if I can figure out how to add water into that mix, I'd love to do an underwater scene with the Forces of Abyss and the Trident Realm fighting, because that's what's in the fluff, and I actually have those 2 armies, and they're both in Mantic.
Yeah, and that's the new 2-player starter set, right? Which is Abyss and Trident Realms. And if you go back to Halpi's Rift, they flooded the Abyss, right? So, like, it was underwater. There is a precedent there in the fluff for that. So,
and I have the underwater Trident Realm army, so I might as well have the 2 armies fight. And I think it'd look cool.
That sounds cool. Well, Ray, we are at the point where we ask you the 10 toughest questions.
I thought you did that with the winning success list.
Are you ready for our rapid fire 10 questions?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, what's your favorite army?
Ratkin.
What is your least favorite scenario?
Control.
What drives you creatively or competitively?
Competitively.
When your opponent rolls snake eyes?
Crap.
When you roll snake eyes?
Crap. Like,
What is your favorite hobby material?
3D printer.
What is your biggest gaming pet peeve?
Not marking your bases when you're doing maneuvers.
If you had to replace miniature wargaming with another hobby, what would it be?
Probably board games.
What other miniature war game would you not want to play?
Warhammer 40K.
If you had a romantic evening with Ronnie Renton, what would you whisper sweetly to him?
Please make Trident Realm better.
Fantastic. Well, Ray, I really appreciate you coming on. I think you've given a lot of people a different insight. It's always nice to hear different perspectives about list building, and we all have different things we focus on. And I think the way you answer some of these questions is considerably different than some of the people we've had on the past. So I think that's going to give people some pause, and it's going to give people something to think about.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, and hopefully the Forces of Abyss, if anyone wants to talk to me with lists, I'm always happy to do so. Like, I like nerding out. This is nerding out. Why we do Nerve Check is to nerd out. Another plug for the episode listened to by tens of people. And nerding out, talking hobby, it's just great. It's lots of fun.
And we will have a link to the Nerve Check podcast in our show notes. It's available on Podbean and on YouTube. So give it a listen. I noticed you only got like 82 subscribers. We need to pump those numbers up a little bit, Ray, on YouTube.
We don't want to change our tagline. So
fair enough. Fair enough. Fair enough. You're pretty omnipresent all over Facebook. So If you want to reach Ray, you can find him on pretty much any Kings of War related Facebook group. The Northeast one in particular, I know he's on Countercharge, he's on Fanatics. Well, Ray, I appreciate you coming on and talking to us tonight.
Thanks a lot, Rob.
All right, guys. Well, that's going to do us tonight. So thanks for listening. And when all else fails, don't forget to countercharge.
Thanks for listening. And we'll see you next time on Countercharge. Please let us know what you thought of the show by emailing us at counterchargepodcast@gmail.com, on Twitter at countercharge15, or by commenting on the Countercharge Kings of War podcast Facebook group. If you enjoy the show, you can help others find out about it by leaving positive reviews on iTunes. Until next time, keep countercharging. Music is a composition of Kevin MacLeod and is licensed under Creative Commons.